continue to eat while we're getting the conversation teed up. It's always a challenge to have the panel right after lunch. But what I want to try and do is use this as an opportunity to bridge the conversations that we were having this morning and transition to the conversations that we're going to have after this one. Because this is the last introductory panel that are helping frame the challenge. And it's an important one because we had a really rich set of conversations over the last few sessions as well as this morning. And the morning discussion around the challenge and the frontier of labor law, the challenge and the frontier of data and technology are fundamental to what we are going to have to address as a commission. And what we want to talk about in this discussion is how do we think about the role of corporations in that conversation? What particularly in earlier times, we had a conversation from individual employers. We had conversations from small employers and representatives of those. Now we want to have a conversation about large employers. So we're pleased today to be able to convince Dane Lynn, whose bio is in the material, and I will allow him to have a little introductory remark about where he is now and the work that he's doing. So I'm not going to give an extensive bio other than to say Dane has a rich set of experiences prior to his current role at the U.S. Business Roundtable as an ability to bridge both the business community, the workforce community, and trying to think about how do we translate ideas into action. And so we're really pleased that he could join us today. Also want to thank him because we've pushed back the panel for an hour because of wanting to ensure that we have the richness of the conversation, which will cause him to take a red eye back tonight. So,
thank you.
But above and beyond the call of duty, but Dane was extremely generous to say, I am not going to miss this conversation because the work that they have been doing at the U.S. Business Roundtable is fundamental. And he wanted to come to a place like California where we can engage with those ideas into a place where something can happen. And so that's the purpose of the conversation today, is to have a discussion with Dane about the work that they've been doing at the U.S. Business Roundtable, the perspective of large employers, and where we go from here. So let me, again, thank you for joining us, Dane. I'm going to just do a couple questions, then we'll save most of the time for commissioner questions, so be ready. First of all, Dane, can you just, before we jump into the substance, just make sure so that everyone's grounded, what is the U.S. Business Roundtable? And you recently released a statement. And so can you do both of those and give us a little context?
Yeah, absolutely. Don't feel too sorry for me, because the first thing I do on a return flight is I search out if there's a masseuse. So I know there is someone that will give a massage in the airport with that before I take that red eye. But a couple of things before I tell you who BRT is in this recent statement that we released on the purpose of a corporation. My word for this year is convictions. But I also know that in order to remain happily married, I should listen to my wife, because she often selects a word for me, but hers often turns into phrases. So her phrase for me this year is put down the phone. So I am being very cognizant of when I go home in the evenings that I'm not going to get the bone behind my spine protruding, because I'm constantly on the phone. But I am so glad to be here, because the issues that you've discussed this morning at a personal level are very important to me. I come from a state that could not look any more different than California. I come from a state that has the highest per capita number of opioid deaths in the country. I come from a state that has 1,000 children in foster care, because parents and grandparents and aunts and uncles are dying every day. That is a state, that is West Virginia. The opioid addiction is just incredible, the scale of it. And I am so pleased that we're having this conversation here, because there are individuals, not just individuals that need reskilled, there are individuals formerly incarcerated, there are individuals who are formerly addicted. They don't want to live on public assistance. They want training. They want to figure out, they want help on how to be productive members of this society. I have 5 of them working for me right now. We bought a former lumber store, and we're turning it into a coffee shop and a meeting place and a shelter. And You could not believe the work ethic of these individuals, all 5 formerly incarcerated, all 5 currently battling addiction. But those are the people that we really need to focus on helping there, in addition to the population that we're talking about. Our recent statement on the purpose of a corporation has been around since the 70s. But in the 90s, it shifted from a focus on all stakeholders to the primacy being focused on shareholders. And we heard from a number of academics and a number of just experts from around the country in 2018 that they wanted us to revisit that statement. And so we did that over a period of time. And the result is the statement around the purpose of a corporation that in some regards goes back to the importance of serving all of our stakeholders. And I think you'll find, I hope you'll find through some of the stories I'm going to tell, or the examples that I'm going to give, that many of our companies are working in many ways with their with their employees, both prospective, current. They are working in communities, and that working goes beyond making financial investments. And I think it's important to highlight ways in which we're trying to scale that up. Because if we don't scale it up, we're in deep, deep trouble. All we have created are boutique solutions. So with that, that statement being released, we are now working to figure out, and we're being asked, what do the words mean? Translate the words into action. Now, you'll hear me talk about federal policy, and federal policy translates for us our recent support for increasing the minimum wage. Translation also means BRT's recent support for a federal policy on paid family and medical leave. And we will work to advocate for those changes, if not now, next year, the following year. And we will build out a more robust set of policy solutions that are core to, I think, part of the discussion you're having. But there's also a programmatic element. I won't get into those programmatic elements now. We're going to get to them a little bit later. But I think we're going to leverage the 195 members we have, some of the largest U.S. companies in this country. They employ 15 million people, and they spend about $147 billion in research and development every year. How do we leverage that membership so that Cisco, for example, the chair of my immigration committee, I have the, depends how you look at it, I have the fortune of not just leading the ed and workforce, but the immigration portfolio as well. Chuck Robbins from Cisco leads that work. How do we get Chuck Robbins to work with not just the tech sector, but other sectors as well? And I think there's a lot of interest among our members in doing that.
Excellent. So can you tell us a little bit more about, as you framed that document as it relates to the future of work? How is that relevant for the discussion that we've been having in this panel? And what do your members think about? And what are the issues that they're focused on when they talk about the future? What enlivens them? What frustrates them? How do they think about the future of work?
Yeah. In some regards, I wish we would stop talking about it as the future of work, because I think many of our members say the future is now. What do we do to create a future of today for many of the people, the populations that we're talking about? But I think some of their frustrations really are around, and this is as it relates to state policy, that we've not thought similarly to Walmart and the creation of these archetypes around different communities within the state. Southern California is not like Northern California. So how do we allow for more regional strategies? There's a state framework, but a state framework that has enough flexibility for regions to customize and address the challenges that they face. That's, I think, one of the fundamental frustrations that we hear from our members, is that there is typically, vis-a-vis state policy, there's a one-size-fits-all solution. We check the box and then we move on. I think one of the other frustrations and the way they think about the future of work is we have, and we've been guilty of this too, we've largely focused the future of work around post-secondary being defined as 4-year, and the workforce, whether you're in or out. And I know that many of our members have been frustrated by, some would say, the lack of progress in K-12. But to have this conversation absent at least the secondary system, the high school system in the country, I think is problematic. And it's not going to fix the challenges you're trying to, or any other state is trying to address. And a good example of that many of our members have been really pleased with is in Tennessee. I mean, despite the political changes among the governorship, they have worked from 8 years to 8 years to 4 years and getting governors to work together to build an infrastructure that, regardless of who's governor, the strategy is sustainable over time. They're not starting over year after year. Two more that I would focus on, that I would mention, Lenny, in response to your question. And now I'm going to dive a little bit into the weeds, the workforce boards. We are at the table, but the workforce boards are not exactly the best example of an entity within state government that's being responsive to employers' needs. And the workforce boards, despite their resources, actually do very little training. How do we not just get business leaders at the table, but how do we actually get them to bring the data to the table to influence, not just influence, but to change behavior? I think that's what's really important to us. And lastly, data. I've been very impressed with the work Ohio has been doing with employers to do more than just build a platform, but a dynamic place where consumers can go to find the jobs that are available, the skills that are required to get those jobs, and then a link to a whole suite of services, wraparound services, that will help the most disadvantaged populations to figure out how to use that information. How do I match what my skills are today with the jobs that are available? How do I acquire additional skills that allow me over time to take advantage of better jobs that I don't yet qualify for?
Those are great. And I'm going to ask one last question, then open it up. So if people have questions or comments, turn your cards and we'll start around the table. And I'm going to do this the same way that Londe did, is I'll collect 2 or 3 at a time so we get as much conversation going as possible. So my last question for you, Dane, is, and I'll start it with the cynic's perspective, but I'm going to turn it to giving you the opportunity, with James Manika's word, to be an optimist about this. So the cynics would say that the statement from the Business Roundtable was terrific public relations and not going to go anywhere.
Yeah.
If you're an optimist to say, we actually believe it will, and we would like California to be the place where that goes from statements to action, what would be your recommendations for us?
It is not a political play, but I can say that 100 times over, and you may still not believe me. So I think the best way to answer that question, again, is by example, because I think these examples could influence your recommendations, what could happen in California. And I'm going to go to an effort that we have called the Workforce Partnership Initiative. We have pulled together a number of companies that are working in partnership with San Jose State University to have companies sit at the table and talk about the jobs that they're having the most difficult time filling, to scope out the career pathways so that once a data analyst, you're not always a data analyst. Scope out those pathways, get companies to bring their subject matter experts to sit at the table with San Jose State University faculty to review the curriculum, for our companies to make commitments to bring in interns and apprentices, for our companies to give preferential treatment to the students that pursue those programs and complete them, because companies have confidence in the program vis-a-vis the competencies that they've worked together on, and hope those ultimately turn into full-time jobs. We'd love to replicate that at scale, not just in California, but in regions around the table. We have never had as much interest today since I've been at the BRT eight years of companies wanting to work with higher ed. Career tech ed, 2 years and 4 years. So think about not just models, but what are the policies that actually help support the regional collaborations like that? The second, which we're going to do at the national level and would strongly encourage this commission to think about forging your own partnership with companies to figure out how do we move more toward a skills-based hiring system. I acknowledge the challenges that were addressed in earlier panels around algorithms and the biases, but I think we have an incredible amount of interest, not just to eliminate degrees. That's not what we're trying to do. How do we actually get companies and institutions to work together to help companies recalibrate their HR systems? We have a lot of jobs, as Ginny Rometty, the chair of our Education and Workforce Committee says, they have a lot of jobs that no longer require a bachelor's. They pay pretty darn well. They have great benefits. They may now require an associate's. How do we get companies to change the aperture of those qualifications? More importantly, how do we show the employee the opportunities to gradually move up? Economic mobility, better jobs, better pay, at least within the company if they so desire. But for the commission to think about the ways in which public sector dollars in collaboration with private sector dollars could actually do this maybe within a sector. If some of the fastest growing jobs in California are in IT, how do you bring the IT, the private sector from IT to work together? Say, we want to help you recalibrate the way you look for talent, the way you keep talent, the way you reskill talent, which is, I think, in my last point, another part of this discussion. Part of this commission strategy has to make sure we don't forget about the reskilling. I mean, we look at what AT&T's doing. They have built their own curriculum to reskill their workers. What makes me nervous is that we could actually end up with credentials awarded by the private sector that limit mobility of workers because they're not recognized from company A to company B to company C. So how do we get companies and institutions to work together so that there's a common courtesy? Excuse me, courtesy too, but currency as well. Common currency that benefits the employee.
Okay, fantastic. That's a great starter list. And what I'm going to do, we've got a number of cards up and I'm going to try and get through all of them in the 25 minutes that we have. Is I'm going to group them in threes and let our co-chairs have the last questions. So, and since I'm left-handed, I'm going to go left-handed and counterclockwise just to mix this up. So we'll start with the three over here, Granholm, Hastings, and Yee. Do you guys just want to raise your question and then we'll take all of them and then let Dane answer?
You started by talking about West Virginia and the opioid crisis. And I think a lot of us view the opioid crisis as a symptom. These are, if people are dying of opioid overdoses, these are deaths of really despair, right? Communities that have been left behind. And so while so many communities in California are thriving, there are a lot of communities that are left behind. And so the place-based strategies that you were describing, I think are of huge importance. A lot of people don't want to move. They were raised in a place, they're loyal to a place. They want job providers to come to that place. And so the question is, what are the best strategies? We all know tax incentives and all of that, but they are unique. I mean, you could create industrial clusters that have comparative advantage in areas, but that have a wraparound strategy, economic development strategy, that would make it irresistible for a company to locate in a place, which includes, of course, training. It includes some sort of access to capital. It includes all of the things that might create a cluster. And I'm wondering if you can advise this group about what are the best policy strategies to incentivize place-based jobs so that people aren't despairing.
That's
We're going to group
Go ahead.
3. Go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dane, for your presentation. The nice part about what you've shared with us already this morning is the fact that when large companies act, they can provide a tectonic shift in the perception and by leading in these particular spaces. And it started a decade ago with the revision of the mission statement. But we're the California Future Work Commission, but there are solutions all around the country that it's the larger companies can help bring that to bear rather than just relying on the companies that are based here or only operate here. Because the economy is global, so the society is national, even global probably as well. But there is a large tail of smaller businesses that if an example is provided at what I'll call the macro level, it helps a great deal. And recognizing that California is different because we deal daily with, is California a first choice for an employer to create a job? Probably not. And trying to get at the root causes of those, I think will help all of us. But to the extent that your members lead is fantastic. Do more of that because I think you're getting a lot of traction. Certainly I'm on this commission because I think it was our first or second convening when we highlighted the new mission statement. And it was, if I recall correctly, it was applauded when that was put up on the screen. So, keep on doing what you're doing, especially when you lead, because I think you heard this morning that the tension that exists between employers and workers, it's pretty real. And helping to break that down is really appreciated. So I know it's not a question, but thanks.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dane, for being here. I wanted to just kind of delve into this issue of what constitutes stakeholders. And, we've been reading a lot about how, particularly with the changing workforce, that there are many who are working in large companies today that feel that there's a different way of demonstrating corporate responsibility, whether it's on climate, whether it's on other types of issues that are top of mind. But how much of what you're trying to develop in terms of this statement becoming actionable is going to be informed by stakeholders, either internal to the companies or externally in the communities?
Okay. Got those 2?
Yep. Let me take Governor Granholm's question first. This is a tough one, and I think we need to see whether or not the intent of the opportunity zones, which is the federal legislation, actually creates the opportunity in these communities. And we as an organization are working with our members to help them not just become familiar with what that legislation says, but the opportunity it presents for individuals in the communities that you're talking about. I think we are working to try to get companies who, like IBM, have come into West Virginia. They may not be thousands of jobs, but they've gone into communities after a recalibration of jobs to say, wow, we can go up to North Central West Virginia. We have hired 35 or 40 workers in that community, which in its own way creates some economic resurgence. Those individuals have more money to spend. One would like to think over time that maybe other regions around the state receive the same benefit, or other companies see how it's working and they want to come into those communities as well. Has any state done that well? I would say no. I think this same problem occurs in places like Dayton, Ohio, where 90% of the companies that make medical devices are in Dayton, Ohio. I love Ohio, but very few people are moving into Dayton, Ohio. And the population that's there, many of them are not able to take advantage of those jobs. So how do we get those employers to work together? I also think that maybe many of our companies are not going to be in those communities, but our suppliers will be. So how do we forge relationships in a way that benefits individuals in those communities, although it may be a supplier presence, not a Cisco presence? I think it achieves the same outcome. On the second question, this new effort we're going to announce, which is, since we're live streamed, we are not just soliciting input from the HR folks. We think it's vitally important to get people in the front line. We get subject matter experts who help us with the curriculum, but we get people, we've been working with companies identifying the employees who actually can be a part of our work. So it's not a complete disconnect from national organization to membership. It's actually working with some of those individuals who know day in and day out. So when we released this statement, we said it's about customers, communities, employees, and we meant that. And so we need to integrate all of those different audiences that we're trying to impact to the work that we're doing on the ground in particular. Last example I would give you as an illustration is in the Triangle. So we're down in Raleigh-Durham, working with a lot of institutions, 2-year and 4-year, and we've asked those institutions to also bring students to be part of the work that we're doing. What are the prospective students? And they're not all new to higher ed. Many of them are going back for retraining. So we're also getting students in addition to our own employees' input into the work that we're doing.
Okay, thank you. We're going to take the next 3 and then the next 3 and the last 2. So we're going to do rapid fire for a while here. So Saru and then
Hi.
Maria and Doug.
Can you hear me and see me?
I can hear you and now know where you are.
Okay. You said, well, you asked us, what are the ways in which an association like yours can be helpful on these issues?
Yeah.
And, I think when we think about an association like this, we've seen, a statement you've made, like I'm just going to take minimum wage as an example because something I work on a lot. So you put out a statement on minimum wage. Many of the companies in your list that I've seen online have raised their own wages on their own. But I think one thing that could be really helpful that I'm wondering how to really pursue is the business fairness argument. So on minimum wage in particular, as people have heard me talk about, the restaurant industry gets to pay $2.13 an hour, while all these other corporations are having to pay a full minimum wage. And so why isn't there an outcry, outrage from all these other companies that are at a disadvantage? They're having to pay the full minimum wage as it goes up, but this one industry gets to stay behind at $2 an hour. How is that fair? And I think the same argument could be made in a number of different contexts. Geographically, California does have higher wages. How is it fair to your companies that they're paying more? Why should the rest of the country should come up to our standards? There's a business fairness argument. And so it's great to make statements. It's great for the companies to do their own thing, but how can we engage your members in a really zealous and active business fairness argument so that we can push other companies on the things they're doing wrong?
Great, thank you. Thank you. Rick.
Thank you very much for being here and for sharing what you have. When I read the corporate statement the first time, what I reflected on is many of our members at the Chamber of Commerce. I think there's a lot of really great examples of companies that are great things with their workforce. And when I saw the statement, to me, it reflected some of the examples that I was seeing just within the Los Angeles region. But 2 points that I'd like to comment on, and you mentioned a little bit about scaling, because I think some of those examples, I think through the Business Roundtable, there's an opportunity, a bird's eye view of some of those examples. What is the best way to scale that? And when I see that in Los Angeles, I think, how can we make it go statewide?
Yep.
But you're probably in the best position to be talking directly with the decision makers, CEOs at the table, to be able to say, how do we take what you're doing and, scale it on an even broader level? So that was one thing. The second thing, because it is at a national, it's also important to have the perspective, national effort. I do think it's also important and would love your thoughts on how do you then bring that back to local communities? How do you take these principles that have been signed on to and have those actions actually be felt and seen at local community levels?
Great, thank you. Doug Block.
Thank you. And I looked through your impressive list of member companies and noted that several of them have partially, or in some cases, and I was hoping to get your opinion about the role of joint labor management partnerships in workforce development.
Okay, great. So can take those three and business fairness, scale, and proximity and joint.
Yeah, short-term memory's not good, so I was writing. I think to the first point about business fairness, I think that is something that, thanks for raising it. It's not something that we've talked about, be perfectly candid, but something that I am now armed with as we figure out what's our strategy moving forward on the minimum wage. How does that fit into the equation of what we
Love to talk
what we
about
do?
it more.
So let's exchange cards.
Okay.
To the question about scale, this is exactly why I think it's important for public sector CEOs, governors, to work with private sector CEOs. The point you're making is, I think Ohio is a really good example because we have the CEO of American Electric Power, who happens to be the chair of the Ohio Business Roundtable, working now with the new governor and the lieutenant governor to say, okay, BRT, you're focused with the union and others in higher ed working in the Columbus region, but what's the state role? What's skin in the game is the state going to have for replicating Columbus regions of the state? So that is, we have no success to talk about yet. That is a work in progress, but we need to be able to quantify what that success looks like. But we take your point, and we're trying to aid and do the same thing in many other states that we're working in. And couldn't agree with you more. I mean, where it's felt at the local level the most is at the individuals. So we want more individuals not just taking advantage of these opportunities, we want them getting jobs in our companies. We want them to have the opportunity to have the internship or apprenticeship in our member companies. So that's for us where it stops is impacting individual lives. Joint labor partnership. So the joint employer rule that has come out, and the debate around that actually is something we have worked on, not in great depth, to be quite frank with you. But that is also, in the spirit of candidness or transparency, falls in our corporate governance committee, and one of my colleagues has worked on that. But I would be happy to follow up with you with greater specificity.
Okay, great. Thank you. The last three questions before we go to our co-chairs to close this section out. Roy, I'm going to do four because I didn't see your card up, John. It's the four of you right here.
Okay. I'd like to talk about the role of large. To the mic. I'd love to talk about the role of large corporations more generally in some of the future of work issues that we've been looking at. There's a narrative that many of us have discussed that while productivity has grown dramatically in the United States and corporate profits have, wages have not. And there are those who believe that corporate concentration of power, especially relative to working people, is a root cause. And I'm curious if you see any role for that analysis, and also in bringing the statements to life that you've made, what role you believe the sacrifice of large corporations needs to be? What, if any, what price, if any, do corporations need to pay in order to create a system that works more generally?
Go ahead, John.
Okay, so thank you. The UFCW is a member of the Council of Institutional Investors, and as you may remember last year, in the wake of the Roundtable's letter, CII issued a critical response, essentially saying that the public markets, the financial markets, would be adequate signals that CEOs and executives should be following, and not listen to this squishy stuff about stakeholders. So on behalf of the UFCW as a member of CII and the entire labor caucus at CII, I apologize for CII making that statement. And I would say that the director who was behind that statement, if he had not already been planning to leave, will be planning to leave right now. There was quite a reaction to that.
Thank you.
One valid point I would say that letter did raise, though, was that the public markets do create lots of short-term incentives for executives. And in the absence of anything other than sort of structural change to change that, how are we going to change the behavior of those executives? Executive compensation, governance, including board seats for other stakeholders. What are some concrete structural reforms that you would advocate?
Great, thank you. Dr. Coley, did you want to ask a question in addition? Okay. Art Pulaski.
Dane, three quick ones. First is, when you find out, can you share with me the name of the massage person you've got? I've got to take a red eye in 2 days myself. So, secondly,
We'll take an Uber together.
Secondly, we also are concerned about the local WIB investment, local WIB boards. From the labor point of view, we feel like, contrary to your feelings, our feelings tend to be that WIB board is more responsive to the corporations than they are to the unions, to the workers. So maybe we should figure out how to work together on that one.
Yeah.
Now, the third thing is following up on what was shared a minute ago in terms of, we start our discussions here about income inequality as being a priority for us. Yesterday I was in Sacramento where there was a bill introduced that gave incentives to corporations to reduce the differential between executive pay and the frontline workers' pay. And I think it's consistent with our experience that executive pay is getting way out of hand, given the fact that the workforce is so underpaid these days. And so I would like your response to that, thinking on that.
Yeah, you are, all of those questions, many of those questions actually are questions that our corporate governance committee under the leadership of Alex Gorski, who's the CEO of Johnson & Johnson, are actually beginning to wrestle with. It would be not only inaccurate, I'd be getting way ahead on my skis to give you a set of responses when, in fact, the CEOs on the committee have not yet had those conversations. That said, there's a recognition of some of the issues that you're raising. I mean, we've clearly, the one we've heard the most about is CEO pay, and the discrepancy, if you will, between frontline workers and CEOs. But we've also, I think, under the leadership of our former chairman, Jamie Dimon at JP Morgan Chase, and we're now led by Doug McMillan, the CEO of Walmart, have begun to have conversations about this question around the price of sacrifice that companies need to pay. And what does that look like? Does that, internally, but what does that look like through maybe more investments than they're currently making? Because there are some individuals on the Hill that say we're not making investments in training. So you need to be taking some of the profits and making additional investments in the way you train the existing workforce and what you're doing to reach out to communities and train more individuals, which I think is part of what we're trying to do. But those are all discussions, and apologies for being somewhat vague, that the corporate governance committee is having.
And assume that's also the question around short-term pressure that you were asking as part.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Dr. Clay, I'm sorry, I missed you.
No, one question in terms of the Business Roundtable's focus on diversifying the workforce. Can you share what strategies, first of all, the commitment, and then the strategies, and what would success look like from the standpoint of the members of the Business Roundtable?
So thanks for the question. One of the key objectives of the Workforce Partnership Initiative is to get companies, particularly, and I think you mentioned earlier today, the STEM fields. What do we do to target, for example, the historically Black colleges and universities and other minority serving institutions to be our partners in this effort? So, for example, NC, North Carolina, AT&T would be one of those examples. But how do we get those institutions to be a part of these partnerships that we're creating? Because that gets those individuals much earlier in the pipeline. And it's a more deliberate attempt, but we attempt to recruit those individuals. I also think that we, as part of Skills First, are looking to reach out and not just revamp HR systems and focus more on skills. How do we move beyond what I frequently say to some of our own member companies? There's a universe of 5 places that we go and recruit talent from, and yet we can't find the talent we need. Where's the problem? So I think part of our efforts are to say, stop going to the luminaries or what you think are the luminaries and expand that universe of institutions, whether they be land grant, public, private. But I think the way to help companies do that, and I would go to, I don't know how many people are familiar with the college scorecard that the U.S. Department of Education has come out with. I think that is an excellent tool that we're hoping to use to say to our companies, look at the completion rates. You don't have enough data analysts or people in cloud computing. Look at the completion rates at X institution. You've never thought about going to that institution. The other vehicle that we're hoping to use to get our companies to expand that universe is an entity that we actually created known as the Credential Engine. And what the Credential Engine, that nonprofit's doing, they've created a credential registry, which we now are going to have 15 states that are putting all credentials, all competencies within every program on the credential registry. We want to expand that to include completion rates, employment rates, disaggregate the data so that our companies can go to the registry, say, wow, I never thought about going to the College of Charleston. I'm only going to these other institutions. Beyond the employers, though, how do we get consumers to make more informed choices about using those tools about where they're seeking out, in this case, a credential? Because unfortunately, there's such a severe lack of career counseling, which is another area I would encourage this commission to think about, that consumers are making choices that sometimes lead them to ending up in greater debt than what they are today and without a job. So how do we use those two tools, the college scorecard? How do we as an organization use the scorecard and the credential registry? And would strongly encourage this commission to make a recommendation that California be more transparent and put their credentials in all of the competencies for every program on that registry.
Okay, now I'm going to ask our co-chairs to take us home on this one with either closing statements or questions on this topic.
I just want to thank the commission, the Secretary of Labor, and you, Lenny, for organizing this, because I said this to Dane when I had lunch. For me, when the Business Roundtable statement came out, it increased my hope of a potential shift in our nation that could be game-changing if the intention can be operationalized. And that's kind of what I hear the people yearning for.
Yeah.
And I think you put your finger on it most, Maria. And your beginning with the West Virginians makes me think of the 35% of California who are working more than one job every day and are living in poverty because of the structural way they are all blocked from, the fullness of their potential. And then I think about the panels who've talked about these skills gaps. We can't find software developers, registered nurses, carpenters, and medical assistants are the top 4 jobs in our state where there's this big gap. And then there's, 5 million people who would love the opportunity to fill the need, but there's no way, even if there was a registry they could click on. So it made me wonder when you said, I would love to see private CEOs, public CEOs thinking together. Could you imagine some sector of large employers that could be catalytic for us? And I think Lance and Maria might have the best sense that would be willing to have some tripartite understanding that they own more than their direct employees in terms of future intervention on inequality that's holding us all back. And that if the most important thing we could do that was sort of interest-based initially was on this question of how do I get my shot at being able to do what I always dreamed of, but felt like I had to set it aside because of my family circumstance. And employers need me to be able to do it. And it makes me think the problems are so profound and they're so clear. And the statement makes you realize, oh, wow, there are large CEOs in this country that actually do want to create a social compact. And is there a way in your minds, and I think it's more Lance and Maria because they have the relationships here in the state, but what set of employers would be willing to join us in an experiment that maybe suspended their philanthropic giving for the next 5 years and intended that philanthropic giving to intervene on structural inequality in the state in some profound way that kind of unleashed the talent of the group that you said, I understand it. Problem solving, collaboration, creativity. When you're living in poverty and working 2 and 3 jobs, those skills are like turbocharged because it's the only way you can care for yourself and your family. And I'm curious if you think there's an intention where people would get out of their direct company and think as a whole with us on some big way, but we'd want to also address the self-interest of the companies as well. So that's what's been rattling around as I listen.
It's exciting. I think in many ways, Mary Kay said most of what I was going to say, but let me maybe take this to a couple other places in that direction. One of the things that has been impressive about what the BRT has been trying to do is to really engage and start this conversation in a way and shift the conversation in ways that we haven't had before. So I'm wondering about the way to have impact. This is really an invitation, Dane, for you and the BRT and members of the BRT to think about a couple of things. One is, because the BRT is mostly large companies, one of the things that large companies can do is actually raise the floor across a whole set of things: job quality, wages, which you're tackling. There's a whole set of things with the the kinds of things that Sarah was raising. But there's a way that the BRT can actually raise the floor for everybody by virtue of your size and scale. There's also a way in which the BRT can catalyze change in the rest of the system. Even though you have 150 members, all those companies have very large supply chains. They're very large ecosystems of small and other kinds of businesses that participate in them. And in fact, if the BRT changed practices and standards, those could potentially ripple through their supply chains and their value chains. So I wonder also, are there things that should be on your work plan that are of that form that could catalyze change in the system as a whole? And then finally, I think we would like to invite the BRT to kind of innovate and collaborate with us in the sense that we're us here as the state of California. I think you've got the largest economy in the country, the 5th largest economy in the world, and I think an opportunity to both innovate and collaborate with the state of California. And I think we'd like to also to invite you to take a look at the fact that as part of this commission, we've actually developed a a working draft of the kinds of challenges that we see in the state of California. There's a working document. We're still working on it, and we're going to keep working on it. But I think it already identifies some of the issues that we see in the state. I think we would love it if, in fact, the BRT were to look at that and think about, are there collaborations, innovations to work with California on, given that we're starting to articulate what the challenges and the opportunities are. That's an invitation to the BRT.
Okay, Dane, give you a couple minutes and then we're going to give you an applause and a massage on the way to the airport.
The cookie's the first step. We would be very interested to take you up on the invitations that you've offered. You're exactly right, James. Beyond our 195, the number of companies we heard from in follow-up to the statement who are not BRT members was significant. How do we capitalize on that interest, not just in the statement, but actually changing, to use your word for the year, or increasing the level of opportunity that's available to the people that we're talking about as part of this commission. I think we would love to sit down and figure out what that looks like. Clearly, what's the business interest? But I think there's so much interest from our CEOs that this is way beyond the business interest. So let's figure out when to follow up.
Well,
and Mary Kay is cheerleading. Let me say to that point though, two more quick points. Wraparound services, I mentioned it earlier, but there are academic supports and there are non-academic supports. And what do we do for the single mom who's holding down 3 jobs? She's going to school at night, but she may not go back the second semester because she can't afford it, or she can't find a babysitter, or she can't afford a babysitter. What does public policy look like in the state around for wraparound services? And then really in the weeds, less than 1% of the students who receive federal work study in this country actually work in for-profit companies. There's a cap of 25%. We have been pressing the administration to lift the cap entirely, so more individuals who get federal work study can work in for-profit companies and not just get paid $7.25 an hour, which is what federal work study students get paid for the most part. But how do they get paid? How do they not just have that opportunity, but how do they also make the same hourly wage as the non-federal work study eligible students? Why is that important? If our companies are hiring earlier and you're getting the internship the summer of your sophomore year and you're invited back, you have a job offer at the end of your junior year. But we need more students in working in for-profit companies versus serving breakfast, lunch, and dinner in the school cafeteria.
Well, that's a terrific way to close, to take us from principles and statements to a presumptive yes to collaborate, to a specific example of how we turn something from an idea into action. So again, really appreciate you making the time, and we will absolutely follow up with you. And please join me in giving Dane a round of applause and a certificate for a massage at the airport. Turn it back to the...
Thank you, Lenny.
So, hello everyone. I'm Lynn Jeffrey from the Institute for the Future. I'm just going to give you a quick rundown on what the rest of the day is going to look like. We are really excited to get to the solutions conversation, and that's why you've been moved into these small groups, and we'll move you back after the conversation with the small group is done. We're going to spend a little bit of time with the co-chairs sort of putting a cap for now on the problem statement document, enough that we can move forward with that to a conversation about solutions. We will be hearing a report back from Carla, Commissioner Javits, on a stakeholder conversation that she had. And we will also be hearing from Commissioner Granholm a bit of a report back on the dinner from last night, Those will be just short 5-minute, will give you a taste of what other people are doing. And then we will move into small group discussion to get your first round of what are the big ideas that you've been carrying around that are top of mind. We know you have them. Think ahead if you want to use that worksheet as a way to organize your conversation in the small groups, the worksheet in your folder, or to organize just your own thoughts. That's available to you. We'll be doing the small groups, recording everything, collecting everything, and then we'll share back. And then we'll really open it up for a whole group conversation about what we heard from that first flowering of ideas. So Mary Kay and James, if I can turn it back over to you. Thanks.
Thank you. So you saw an email from James and I on Thursday, I think, of last week with a document that we've co-created over the last 3 to 4 convenings and that the labor staff have worked on. And the question here is, do you have a judgment on the sentence that we put in the document, which is, we believe, James and I, after having read it, and I don't know how many people got a chance to actually absorb it around this table, that this captures the intention and the range of problems that we've collected as a group. And the first part of this conversation is basically just to do a gut check on that belief that we share, and then understand, I think as you've said probably 2 or 3 times in the course of the day, that this is a living document, and as we move through February and March, there may be tune-ups to it. So what we're looking for here is overall sense that we're headed in the right direction. Roy.
So my reaction is yes, subject to one thing that may be outside the scope of this document and one within the scope of the document. Okay. Outside the scope of the document, meaning maybe this is somewhere else in our final report, I thought this did an exceptional job of capturing what the issues are without really talking much about why these are the issues. And I think we need some story about how did we get here and why, because literally I think the only explanation relates to technological change, and it's much more than that. And without that, it's hard to put our solutions in context. That leads us to laundry listing. The second, which I know I communicated, just want to say here, is within this document, I think it is missing one major problem area. And I think this document largely assumes the prosperity that we've had as an overall economy and then seeks to figure out what we do about that prosperity. And if we imagine this document lasting for 10 or 20 years, surviving through economic ups and downs, I think it's essential that we articulate a forward-looking vision for how we prosper and continue to innovate. What do we need to invest in? And last time we met, I described it as what kinds of work do we think our society needs to have done that are not yet done? And right now, I mean, it's in number 11, which I'll note didn't even make the worksheet. It got cut off. We have 1 through 10. And even that number 11 says California should make the most of its prosperity, standing, innovation, as opposed to, I think we need to assume that that prosperity is not a given. That depended on the hard work of many working people, governments, corporations for decades. If we want to keep having that, we, I think, need to articulate that as a problem.
Great, thanks. I just really appreciate, Roy, you kicking us off, because that's sort of the altitude that we wanted to get a sense of the whole from. Yes.
I had a similar response. I thought it was an outstanding document. And as I was reflecting on living through the recession, it in some ways it is, and we know that there are sacrifices that have to be made, but what are the non-negotiable floor, regardless of the of us being in good times or bad times? There's just something basic and principle with regards to people.
Yeah.
And so how do we, so that it is not seen as a document of if we have good tax revenue, it is a document that is just the core values of our state.
Great, thank you. Others? Yes, Betty.
Thank you. I thought the document was really comprehensive. I think to Roy's point, I felt like it read a little bit more like a fact sheet than kind of a problem statement. And I think the problems are kind of hidden in here. And I thought maybe kind of elevating those a little bit so they're a little bit more crisp. And I always think about when we put something forth in writing, kind of the audience. And I think because it is so heavily kind of just backed up by a lot of information, that the salient points about what our focus will be going forward is kind of lost.
Got it.
But apropos of the discussion today, and I'm not sure if we're ready to go here, but it seems to me that the unique opportunity this commission has had is to really be worker focused and kind of human capital focused. And I had a little bit of a visceral reaction when technological change showed up in paragraph 3 on page 1, because that's not what this is about. And I think we have a lot more that we've exposed ourselves to, and so I think our solutions are going to be a little bit more comprehensive. And then, but I guess in terms of the audience, and as I've begun to go out and talk to people, the 2 points that really kind of come back and resonate is, and I think how people think about it in terms of what's in it for themselves is how do they fit into all of this? And so kind of the demographics, which we talk here about the workforce and how many are really not making it. And then also what's happened over the last 40 years. And so I think those 2 kind of points really kind of set the context. But there's a lot here, and I'm just happy that we were able to capture it all. So great job on that.
Great,
Okay.
Thank you. Yes. Carmen.
Yeah, I thought it's a terrific start, and it's a great document. I had just a couple of thoughts. I think one of the things we've talked a lot about is giving people a different narrative, and in a sense, busting some of the myths. And just as an example, constantly hearing, well, the economy's hot. Gee, we're scratching our heads about why wages haven't gone up, and it's like, okay, well, it doesn't work that way anymore. And isn't this an opportunity to say it doesn't work that way anymore? This is something, we're giving a new version of what the economy really looks like. So something around that. Second, I thought there's been a lot of discussion about kind of the dynamic relationship, tension, just the relationship between workers and employers that relates to skill building and training, but it relates to a lot of other things. And I didn't get any sense of that, in that write-up. So I think there could be more on that relationship. Third, I thought there wasn't really much mention or any mention of evidence-backed initiatives, results, orientation. At least there should be something in here about that, a results orientation in terms of the kinds of things that we're going to advocate for. And then, maybe parochial point, but I do think, look, incarceration and homelessness are huge issues in California. They're mentioned here, but they're not usually thought about in relation to work. That work is a central issue in solving those very big problems. And I think that's another example of a myth-busting, thing that we could highlight. And then lastly, in terms of data, talks about unemployment, the unemployment rate, but it doesn't really reference workforce participation. And I just think, again, in terms of myth busting, it would be nice if we could highlight that a little more and, the significance of that.
Great, thank you. As I'm listening, my general sense of our intention here is to collect these high-level comments, move to the solutions, and return back to the commission with the reorientation in the way that you're suggesting it to us, all right? Lance and then Saru. And John, okay.
Thank you very much. I think I raised in one of the earlier commission meetings that a lot of what we put, at least in this document, tends to, an observation, not a criticism, static. We've identified the problem, it's a fact sheet, so it's static. We're living in a very dynamic society with a high velocity. So it's not just moving and evolving. Everything around us is changing weekly, if not monthly. And the technology that's driving that is something we need to at least acknowledge, hopefully embrace, hopefully manage and steward. But California's role in the global economy, the global social discourse is outsized, and we are evolving so fast that to keep up with that, and it's not like the Constitution that perhaps could be ever evolving, but that's something that as a theme in the work that we're doing, we have to recognize. Now, how we recognize it, there's a lot of debate about that, but to the extent that when we do get to those final parts of our report, some kind of preamble that the pace of change, and I'll just leave it there, is so fast that history will really never be able to truly capture how fast we're moving relative to the last 20 years, 50 years, 100 years. And that's something that I'd like to see. Our industry sector tends to evolve, as quickly as it can to keep up with either demand or, supply chain changes and issues. But that well-articulated document as it is leans more towards the static than the dynamic. And if that's something that we could bring into it over the course of the next few convenings, I think it'd be great.
Great. Thank you, Lance. Saru.
I think like you, I don't want to spend any more time on this after today. Like I want to feedback, whatever changes are made is fine. And then I like to just move forward personally. So I would push for that. But I do just want to say two things. I had Roy's same comment last session in LA that I felt like it was very passive voice and no real naming of the actual drivers of inequality, which is not just that inequality has happened, but that corporations have driven it. And so I really want to appreciate Julie and the team for adding the first line in number 1, get at that, but it's still passive voice. So it still says that those profitable corporations and wealthy citizens have seen their profits as if they did nothing to increase their profits and vis-a-vis others. And so I just would want to name the influence that they've had over our political system, because if we leave it as is, then the solution is simply solving inequality. It's not solving the process by which the inequality has happened. In other words, worker power increasing vis-a-vis corporate power. And so I do think it's important to name that, yes, they've seen their profits increase, but it's happened because of their. And then in number 4, on quality jobs, there's a slight mention of worker protections, particularly around violations of employment law. And I kind of was waiting since September for today's session on employment law, thinking we were going to spend at least a little bit of time on those worker protections, wage theft, tip theft, massive amounts of tip theft, workers' rights. And I understand there was a desire to talk about the data protections, which I totally get, but I felt like we missed a huge segment of employment violations of workers' rights. And I felt like I have to name that on the record because it's a huge issue that we really haven't talked about as a commission very much at all.
It's funny. I remember the way is Lance. I didn't you talk about having your wages stolen and you went home and quit your job and your dad said, "Oh my God, I'm proud of you, son." Yeah. So it was all, I remember the first time I heard it mentioned was through Lance's story of the jobs. John.
Yeah. So again, I really appreciate the work that went into this. I think it's a great document that captures, much of what we've been doing here. I really appreciated Betty mentioning that third paragraph that focuses on technological change and then has a list of other things, but doesn't mention market mediating institutions and how they've declined over this period of time. And I thought that first hearing was so powerful in really framing those being the differentiator. Lance mentioned is that we have such a rapid pace of change now. There was a pretty rapid pace of change in the 60s and 70s too, but we had market institutions that buffered population. I want to make sure we elevate that along with the critique we heard from this last panelist, as well as on that first hearing about the shareholder primacy ideology and how along with it came this belief that the government couldn't play a role in solving problems. The market was going to solve those problems. That's a fundamental difference. And I think the role of government needs to be re-elevated in our discussion.
Yeah, it's a kind of you just gave the story of the initial point, I think, Carla, you were making. Like, how do we develop a new narrative here that busts the myths and leads the way and names the drivers in the way Saru said? Anybody else want to help us with the direction?
Yeah, or is
Oh, I'm
the
sorry.
card that was
Let's
scored
see.
up?
Oh,
Well, okay. Well, I love the conversation we had at the last meeting and the one that we're having right now. I did want to flag something. I don't want to wordsmith because I love the document. But under the portfolio of recommendations, it talks about the role of state government as a legislator, as a regulator, to many people's points here, as an employer and an investor. And John and I were talking about this morning. I think it's really important that we focus on the state as a purchaser as well, because we should be investing in companies that create good jobs. Secondly, and this ties to Roy's point and to Lance's about the pace of change and not taking what we have for granted. And we talked about this at the last meeting, why it's so great to have Governor Granholm here, but I pulled up some numbers. So in 1950, Detroit had the highest per capita income in the United States. And of course, the auto workers had organized the huge industry. The population of Detroit was 1.86 million in 1950, that year it peaked. It's down to the population what it was in 1910 now. And Apple News sent me an article about a woman school teacher who just bought a house for $2,850, which you couldn't even buy a rug for that, a Persian carpet in California for that price. So what we have here is extremely special, but things could change faster. And nobody in Detroit in 1950 would ever predict the Detroit of today.
fabulous. Thank you so much for that incredibly thoughtful aerial view of the document. We've captured the notes, thanks to the incredible team at the table there, and we'll feed it back as we move along. And now I'm going to turn to you, James, for the next section.
Yeah, I was also just going to thank everybody for the input. I mean, I was looking at my notes and trying to at least get a sense of them thematically, and at least I noted kind of six-ish themes that came from the feedback. One is this idea that narrative actually matters, that there's something about how we tell the story, and now that we need to capture, number one. Number two, there's a clear sense, I think, that we need to be able to articulate how we got here, how we got to where we are, partly because it helps us be sharp, but it also helps us think about, therefore, what we need to solve for. And I think some of that has been peppered throughout, but I think there's a way in this to make sure we're very clear about how we got to where we are, number two. Number three, I think there's a sense that came through that there are some things that are core basics, core values that should be at the center, the base of this, regardless of what happens, that we should articulate in some fashion. And then the fourth is a point that I think has been said, and I think you're right, that this is a very dynamically changing environment. And I think part of the capturing the dynamism of this is very important to make sure that we're not just solving today's problems, and we're not just very static, but we actually are looking forward and anticipating the fact that this is moving pretty rapidly. I think you made that point. I think there's also a theme here about myth busting. And maybe that's part of the narrative, but I think there's some things that have structurally changed that we can't solve them the way we used to solve them, or just that are just no longer true anymore. And so we need to make sure we're clear about, are there some things that have truly changed or myths that we need to bust? And then finally, maybe this is a good way to cap it, is where Roy started, which is, and then I think where we ended, we can't take any of this for granted. So there's something in here about, let's make sure that we are also thinking about the kinds of things that will make sure that this continues to be the amazing economic engine that creates work and opportunities for everybody. And how do we make sure that we don't lose that and not take that for granted? So those are at least some of the six-ish themes that I got a sense of. I think what we'll do going forward, because we do want to make this pivot to therefore what we do about all of this, we'll make sure that this gets reflected in the current draft as we have it. But I think more importantly, all of this needs to be very clear when we get to our final output at the end of April. So if you don't see all of this in the working draft, please be patient with the process. But we do want to make sure that, particularly around the narrative and the core values, they do come out in the final recommendations that we have in the final report. This is a living document. This is not the final report. It's not. And so if any of you have any additional thoughts on any of these things, please, there'll be ways to feed this back into the process. But we are looking forward to make sure that we now shift to talk about, okay, so what do we do about all of this? So thank you.
Thank you, James. And now we're going to get 2 report backs to feed the solution set. And the first one from Carla Javits on the roundtable you hosted.
Great. Thanks very much. You can pass that around if you want. So I think the stakeholder input session, and thank you, Maria, for participating in it. And Maria, I think might have some follow-on comments. I think was about one of the myths that we're trying to bust here, which is that there are a lot of people who are outside of the economy or on the margins of the economy who could be who do contribute a lot of value, whose value is not recognized, perhaps, in what they're paid, and also don't really have the opportunity to move in and move up. And for those of you who might have missed it, on Sunday there was a great article in the New York Times called "What Happened to the Knapp Family." That's really worth reading on this topic. And I think, we've heard several of our guests today kind of mention this. So this is the idea of, there are a lot of people who could be delivering more in our economy who can't today. So we brought together 25 people. They run employment social enterprises. I'll give you a definition of that. We had a representative of that here today, Jennifer, who fed us our delicious lunch. And we had also a lot of local government representatives here. So I think this is really important, maybe the most important thing that I would like to get across. A lot of you may not have heard of this term, employment social enterprise. And employment social enterprises are part of the business community. And they're actually most robust community of these employment social enterprises is in California. What they are is businesses that sell a product or service to the market, just like any other business does. And they have a very deliberate social mission, which is to provide employment and training and supportive services, on-the-job training, a paycheck, to people who otherwise would have a very tough time getting a job or keeping a job, in the economy as it is today. And we have a lot of employers who are very concerned about their frontline workforce and often say they can't get people who are well prepared, et cetera. Some of this, of course, is about hard skills, and a lot of this also is about giving people the opportunity to work in an environment where they can learn. We're talking about people with disabilities, including, we heard today, opioid addiction, other addictions, mental illness, immigrants, youth, people who've been incarcerated, people who are homeless, and others. The discussion of the group was really rich, I thought, and was largely about incentives. How can we incent so that right now, maybe this community in California is employing 10 to 20,000 people a year. How can we get that, to be much more scaled up so that it can really be part of the solution to the problems that we've been talking about? They're interested in more, just like any segment of the business community, more capital and technical assistance, because it sounds, maybe I put it quite simply, the definition, but it's very difficult to actually pull that off, have workers who aren't really ready for prime time in a business and make it a successful business and help those workers get trained. So they need technical assistance. So the sheet I passed around is a proposal that REDF and others have worked on for a local empowerment fund modeled on the Federal Social Innovation Fund. And, I just bring it to your attention. I think there's a lot of potential power to that. It's really about evidence, developing the evidence-based, performance-based programming at the local level enables regional investments of the kind that are needed, frankly, to bring this sector to scale. There was also discussion about bid preferences in procurement. We've talked a lot about the supply chain here. Traditionally in the United States, that's gone based on the ownership structure of businesses, minority and women-owned businesses, disability-owned businesses. Arguably, these are businesses with a social purpose. and it's a social purpose that is meaningful to the government. And so it would make sense to include them in the kind of bid preferences and procurement preferences that are routine, that we have developed as a country that have been pretty powerful. There was discussion about tax credits for hiring from these employment social enterprises. We have some tax credit programs. They're very complicated and they're difficult for people to take advantage of and use. So I think thinking about simplicity in the kinds of things that we propose is important. There was some discussion of that. Some of the local government folks were very interested in kind of seeing employment social enterprise as part of a local economic development strategy. And they highlighted a big program in LA called LA Rise, the LA Regional Initiative for Social Enterprise, and LA's local hire programs as a way that is integrating right now public and private employers to train and employ these populations that are often left out. There was a note that some of these are very small businesses. It's important to include them and include their special issues and needs as we think about scale. You can aggregate large numbers from many small companies, so let's not leave small businesses out of the equation. There was certainly a discussion about both reentry and homelessness. Said before, homelessness, 2 people are becoming homeless for every 1 person that we're housing. And a lot of that has to do with job displacement of people when they're, a little bit older, et cetera, large number. And then I think in the document, in our setup document, one thing just to mention is it mentioned the number of people in prison. I think, frankly, that's a less relevant statistic than the number of people under supervision of the criminal justice system. 130,000 people in prison in California, 500,000 people under the supervision of the courts, which obviously impacts their ability to get or keep jobs. There was a lot of discussion, Saru, you would have been very happy about food. That's a very, very important area. We heard about this innovative apprenticeship. We're going to hear in a minute about last night's discussion, but just what a critical industry that is as an entry point, and we really need to elevate that and the training and the inequities that are in there now so that people are able to make more money. And then lastly, I think, there was discussion about something we've talked about a lot here. People there said, could there be a favored business list of employment social enterprises that, could be made widely available through the government? But I think this really becomes part and parcel of this idea of high road employers. Could there be a mark, like a LEED certification, so that becomes something people aspire to? And that's done by these smaller groups. We heard last night, B corporations, and ROC has a robust set of activities it does around that. But could we aggregate some of that at a bigger scale so that the average consumer can see these are companies they should patronize, and also that in terms of B2B, other companies know who they should be working with on a business basis. So again, we have one of the largest employment social enterprise sectors in the United States here. I think it's something we can be proud of. It's a good time to scale it up, and it's a right moment for policies to scale it up. Maria, did you want to add anything?
I did an amazing summary, Carla. Thank you very much for inviting me to participate in that. It really was an amazing listening session to hear from all these social enterprises across so many different types of businesses, business sectors, but the contribution that is being made and where they see their role in the economy, I think plays right into, what you were talking about earlier when Carla mentioned, when we talk about homelessness in our statement and we're saying it's about work, from my perspective, work is jobs. And to make sure that those jobs, that we're being clear that we're talking about those jobs. And that's exactly what was being discussed in this call that we had. The incentives that Carla mentioned, tax credits and things of that nature, I think could get filtered into our conversation as we focus in on solutions.
Yeah, and the Chamber, I should say, in LA has been a great partner to a lot of these social enterprises. So appreciation to you.
And to add to that, I mean, we hear from employers all the time the lack of a workforce, and we're trying to advocate for those workforces that are on the outside. And so this was a perfect tie-in to the work that we do.
Excellent. Thank you so much for priming the pump for our small groups. And the final is from Governor Granholm and Saru. We'll let you reflect since you were the organizer of such an incredible evening. I was so glad my schedule cleared so I could participate.
Yeah, me too. And I am very humbly reporting out, but Saru, of course, is the czar of all of this. So, but so many of the themes that you just described were exactly the themes from last night. How do you use the government's carrots and sticks to incentivize good behavior and address inequality, address these issues? So, of course, the restaurant sector is top of mind given the number of people who work in it. How do you address the employer concern in a very narrow margin field? So yes, you can look at tax incentives. That's one way. Tax incentives for employers who, for example, in the restaurant industry have a differential pay between front of house and back of house. How do you incentivize through maybe employer tax credits for those who pay over $15 an hour for the folks in the back of the house? Those kinds of ideas. What about giving restaurants who are high road restaurants a jump on licensing, put them in front of the line so that they are not waiting for a long period of time for government to act on allowing them to open. By the way, there were about 30 high road restaurants there and businesses there last night. So they're all part of an association called RAISE, for those who were not there. It's with the San Diego, what is it called? The San Diego Good Job. What is it?
Business for Good.
Business for Good. San Diego Business for Good, which is awesome. So let's think about this in a broad way about how we create more businesses for good in the restaurant, in the socials and social enterprise sector, but also other kinds in the retail sector, right? Huge disparities in the retail sector in terms of inequality. So the badging, recognitional credits. Lenny was talking about using the bully pulpit. This is a way of sort of using the bully pulpit to recognize, but then once they're recognized, they get access to this sort of suite of benefits that government can offer as a partner, including technical assistance, perhaps. There was an investor there, and the investment community, this is sort of like what you're talking about with the fund that you propose, is to explode sort of the mission-driven finance loan, which is a small pilot right now, but is there a way that the state can partner and explode it kind of like the Small Business Association and make it bigger and use SBA as a model? So, and then there's one other thing that needs to be mentioned, which is in these sectors, which has been mentioned before, the work adjacent credits. So for people who live far away, is there a transit benefit that can be awarded? Can we think about childcare as a benefit for these employers to help them make ends meet and, achieve these great purposes that many of them are in? What am I missing, Saru?
No, that was amazing. I thought that was amazing.
Anything else you want to add?
I just really appreciate everybody who came and Irvine and Ford for supporting it. That's all.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for organizing it for us. It was really, really great.
Oh, I guess I will say one other thing that came up last night, sorry, is it was a lot about incentivizing all the things that Jennifer mentioned. Also, it was, though, about the ways in which good business associations can actually weigh in zealously on, worker issues like minimum wage, paid sick leave, paid family leave, and have done so both at the local, state, and federal level. And the more that we can get high road businesses into these associations, incentivize more people to join these associations, the more power they have to advocate alongside workers for worker protection.
I would say one other thing is that we didn't really discuss this, but how do you incentivize consumers to patronize them, especially when a lot of the consumers are really on the margin too, and maybe they might see these high road businesses as a little more expensive to patronize. How do we look at that? I think we should consider maybe a sales tax exemption in some way for those restaurants, or something like some other reward to get people to patronize those kinds of businesses.
Great. And now as we turn back to Lynn, one of the things James and I wanted to do was remind the commissioners that you play a three-part role in the idea generation on solutions. One is you come with ideas. Two is you collaborate with other commissioners and encourage other ideas that may build on your own fragment, but the rest of us could fill out, or you are representing a constituency that you're going to go pick the brains of in February and March. And then the third one is once we collect it as a portfolio of ideas, we have to make a collective judgment. Because we've talked about a preamble, kind of this values and vision that we need to tune up, a narrative, the key problem categories, and then we're moving to a portfolio. And our judgment here about which solutions matter most, and do the solutions we're going to recommend in May end up tackling the suite of problems, is really the question that we're now entering. And I'm going to turn it to you, Lynn, for us to get to work.
Okay, so that is exactly what we're going to ask you to do. We're going to ask you to, you should be in groups of 4. I'm going to ask Tom and Saru to switch places because we had, or could Carla, could you sit in Carla's spot at the end of the table?
I need a left-facing.
Okay.
I could be.
We
over
wanted
there.
you to be with this particular group, so we
Okay.
sort of organized the groups. Okay, we'll get the group. So this group.
Sorry.
Basically, these 4, James, starting from James and ending with Betty, you 4 will move over here, and Tom, you will be part of that group. And this group will move over there
Thank you.
to be with your group, which
Sorry.
is Saru. Nope, no problem at all. We're going to have IFTFers will be there taking notes for you, and the Gov team will be there also just to offer any support that you want. This basically is going to be just a half hour, 30 minutes conversation where we want you to share, and we'd like to hear from everyone in the group, what are your top of mind ideas? The worksheet, which you're right, Roy, is missing one of the categories, but luckily you have all the categories in your problem statement document, is just meant as a way for you to organize your thoughts. But we'll share those back, and then we will, at least by the end of today, have a whole set of very, very early initial candidate ideas. Yes, James.
I was going to encourage us to take 2 mindsets as we go into this. One is that we're still generating ideas, so we're not killing anything. To be perfectly clear, we're not critiquing anything. We just want to get a wealth of ideas. And then second, I think, as the process proceeds, we'll undoubtedly probably integrate ideas. There may be a little bit of Tom's idea, a little bit of Mary Kay's idea that come fused together, maybe a little bit of an idea that came from the outside. So let's have in mind that in the end, we're going to try and fuse some of these together. So it's not about my particular idea being in there exactly as I've stated it, because I'm sure all of you will make it better and integrate other ideas to it. So we should just keep that mindset of we're not killing anything. We're going to try and integrate and build on each other's thoughts.
Yeah, especially today when it's the very first conversation. And we will be putting these into a repository. You'll be able to see everyone else's and see your own ideas as well as ideas from other folks. So let's rearrange ourselves and get started.
So Lynn, do you know who's supposed to be here?
This is your after, I'm going to give you 10 minutes optional afternoon break. So if you want to take a break, need to take a break, please take these 10 minutes. Otherwise, continue as you are, and we will start in 10 minutes. We'll come back, and each group will be asked, choose someone, or someone can kick us off. You'll have 5 minutes to talk about the ideas. to move you back to the outside of the table so we can all have a conversation.
Safe travels.
What can I get?
Okay, commissioners.
I know.
Anmal, James, Betty, can you guys please kind of rearrange? We're going to go back around we're going to go back to our seats so that we can have a whole group conversation. Thanks.
Yeah, where did he go? He's over there. Print him out for him.
We have just about 50 minutes.
You got whoever attention you need?
We've got 50 minutes before our public comments.
What? Oh.
We missed that. 5:00. We've got 50 minutes before our public comments.
You were working too hard?
And we'll take about 20 of that to share back from each group. And then Mary Kay and James will host a kind of a final reflections conversation before we stop at 4:30 for public comment. So, we're still waiting for a few commissioners, but I think we should get started. Let's wait for James. Which group would like to go first and is ready to be the first one to share their ideas? And I'll be your timekeeper for 5 minutes. Who would like to start? I believe your mics are on, so. You guys ready?
I need 1 second.
Okay, all right. Does anybody feel ready?
Our group thought Mom Day was recording for us, so we're negotiating over here. Don't worry.
Okay. I see there's a lot of behind the scenes negotiations happening right now.
Yeah, we also wanted to delegate to staff, but they resisted. Yeah, so I'll attempt to. Yeah, we lost.
Great.
I'll attempt to sort of summarize not everything we talked about, but I think we touched on a lot of key themes. We talked about the state of California in its direct role in the economy, and going to problem number 5, worker voice and agency. We thought that we should consider prohibiting companies with labor law violations from receiving any economic benefit from California. Purchasing, investments, tax credits, the whole gamut of incentives that the state of California provides should be denied to companies who are violating the law. Thank you. So that was one item. In terms of other roles of the government as an investor, we wanted to promote economic growth through a dramatic increase in federal and state government funding for R&D. And as a sort of a corollary to that, we wanted to make sure that those investments in R&D were guaranteed to have a payback to the public benefit. Specifically, we want to amend the Federal Bayh-Dole Act to include more specific public benefits along the line of the economist Mariana Mazzucato and her proposals. We want to enable workers to organize outside of the NLRB, particularly those workers excluded from the National Labor Relations Act, as we discussed earlier today. We want to create digital meeting spaces, not physical spaces, but digital spaces for workers to gather and potentially facilitate organizing. We want worker data to be available to workers as well. Let me just see. What else?
So we're asking, Anthony's asking, can you just maybe explicitly call out each different idea when it comes out, so Anthony can record? And what else would you like to hear, Anthony? Anthony, anything in particular that you? Okay, a little bit of context for each one, for each idea, I think would be
Okay.
helpful. Thanks.
Okay, so I guess, the context I started with was number 5 as a problem area, empowering workers. And I'm not sure which problem area we're addressing with the state role as an actor in the economy. Roy, did you have a thought in terms of, I think this started as your suggestion?
Yeah, I mean, I think that
Can you use your mic?
there are some of these where I assume what we'll need to do is have call on the federal government to do something while the state does some part of it. And so maybe that's part of this. I mean, we didn't get into which stakeholders specifically. I don't know if we want to do that here and now. Yeah, okay. I've got it on the sheet.
Okay, I guess I'll round out with a third area and then pass it on to the next group. But I think this goes into the work adjacent category problem area, which was housing. We identified the need for the construction of much more housing, and that we mandate that there be prevailing wage for the jobs building that housing. Anybody else from my group want to add anything?
Just want to see how Anthony has it before we.
And let me ask James and Mary Kay too, because they're going to kind of be listening for the whole set as they come rolling out. Is there anything that you want to that would be helpful for organizing as we go along?
No, I think at this stage it'd be good just to capture all of them. I think the
Yes.
reflection that we'll probably need to make, as we prepare for the next convening, is to see of the ideas we're hearing, how balance is not the right word, but how do they address the different issues that we've raised in the problem statement? How do we make sure they involve not just legislators, but also private sector and others? And also, how do we make sure we're balanced in terms of long-term, short-term experiments and moonshots? But I think it'll be easier to do that once we have a sense of what went through. So that may take some time to get that reflection done.
Great. Anything else anyone wants to add from your group or that you want to add?
We had a number of items, and I'm assuming that we'll gather all of the things, even the ones I didn't identify.
No, please go ahead. Please go ahead and tell us.
whole?
Yeah. Well, how many more do you have?
Quite a few.
Okay. Why don't you tell us the biggest ones that were the biggest priorities for you?
Well, let's see. I'm not sure. I mean, I would give you my own personal one. I'm not sure it would reflect the groups.
We didn't really prioritize. I mean, we were just, I think maybe there's a process question for everybody. We weren't deliberating over importance. We were getting each of our ideas out on the table.
Got it.
And maybe it's, I imagine there are many things that were the same across things that we discussed. Because, we talked about, we discussed some areas where we didn't feel confident in the detail of the discussion to come up with a list of proposed solutions, but where we said we as a commission probably really want to make a statement. So the reason I froze on the housing one is that's every entity imaginable, and same thing with the social safety net. And so I think maybe one way to do it would just be to get things out that we think are likely to be ones that came out in our group that might not be in everybody's conversation. So we make sure we capture as much of the range of ideas as possible.
That sounds good. Yeah. Are there other things you'd like to add then? Please go ahead.
Well, so this is perhaps my personal favorite, but I think, when we think about what power the state of California actually has, the Attorney General has power to enforce the antitrust laws. And the issue of labor market competition and monopsony is one that has been getting increasing attention in the academic literature and the policy literature. And we know that, there are significant problems with wages being depressed by companies all over the state of California. And I think calling on the Attorney General to look closely at this and enforce those laws where appropriate would be a concrete thing we could do.
And then any others, feel free to. Since you're the first group going, we're going to give this a try.
Yes,
and
we
just,
also talked about
yeah.
how the state ought to think entrepreneurially in terms of investments in R&D and those kind of things that the state generate revenue back and ownership back, co-ownership back, and some of those things.
That
We
the
also
state
talked
would share ownership
of those things they invested in
of the things that they invested in with
corporations.
corporations.
For
Okay.
example, we suggested that we invest in R&D for companies that would create jobs and those kind of things.
Sorry, can you speak right into the mic? Thanks.
Yeah, sorry. So that was suggested that, for example, the state invest in R&D to create jobs. And another suggestion was that we think entrepreneurially by gaining some ownership back from those investments. Another thing we talked about was SB 37 in terms of income inequality. That bill says that you incentivize corporations to alter the CEO compensation in relationship to the frontline workers.
Right, that's a current bill. So
Yeah.
was that something where
Concept.
you were, okay,
Yes.
current concept that you'd like to push forward?
Right on.
Yeah, okay.
Roy, anything else?
Great. Yeah, I think now let's get as many of them out on the table as we can. That works well. Please.
So our group will go next.
And can you speak right into the microphone? Thanks.
Sure. So one theme that we discussed is, are there things that California is in a unique position to do vis-a-vis other states? One is that a number of the large tech companies are headquartered in California, and they care not only about their own employees, but the employees of their customers. So Cisco, for example, has the Cisco Network Academy program to train more network engineers. And these are jobs that do not require a four-year bachelor's. So could we get some of the other large companies to do something like that? We also discussed, given California's huge innovation assets, our world-class public and private research universities, venture capital, philanthropy, social enterprises, national labs. Could we harness that to solve some of these big economic and social mobility issues? So an example that DARPA has worked on is the development of advanced training technologies that reduce the time for a worker to gain a skill that is a ticket to the middle class from years to months. So within 4 months, new Navy recruits are outperforming people who've been with the Navy for 8 to 10 years. Is that the type of thing that the state could encourage in the same way that the state took the leadership role in stem cell research and regenerative medicine? We had a discussion about the fact that California is going to need 600,000 new care workers. And is there an opportunity to not only create career ladders around those care workers, but to think about the ways in which long-term care can be financed that doesn't require the elderly, driving themselves into poverty so that they can be eligible for Medicaid. We wanted to know whether there's an opportunity to have a better analysis of what we're currently spending in the area of workforce development, and to see, get a sense for what sort of bang for the buck that money is getting and how that could be improved. There was a discussion of at least prototyping portability of benefits. Obviously, we have that with respect to Social Security. So are there ways to extend that same level of portability that exists for Social Security, but to other benefits as well? Philly, for example, is piloting this in a couple of areas. There was a discussion about what the state could do to encourage high road employment. Could California take the lead on what constitutes a quote unquote good job, and then provide incentives like tax incentives to companies that are involved in the creation of good jobs? A discussion of modernizing labor laws to, for example, cover all sectors, including agriculture and domestic work. a discussion about whether or not we could increase the portability not only of benefits but credentials, by engaging employers. In response to some of the presentations that we heard this morning, creating the equivalent of a GDPR for workers to deal with some of the privacy issues and the idea that consent may not be possible given the unequal relationship between employers and employees. We discussed the idea of upgrading the high school curriculum. So right now, many students are required to take Algebra 2 Trig, and very few people wind up using that in their career. So there's been a proposal, and in the interest of full disclosure, something Schmidt Futures is supporting, of making data analysis an alternative to the Algebra 2 Trig pathway. And there's actually going to be a workshop on that at Stanford in early February. Not really a recommendation, but an admonition to think more about the role of California's colleges and universities in addressing these issues. And then an issue that James raised is the distinction between large employers that sometimes have the resources to do a number of the things that we think are desirable, whereas it's more challenging for small and medium-sized. And how do we have policies that make that distinction and make it easier for small and medium-sized enterprises to do the right thing? And a discussion, but with no concrete recommendation, about the role that monopsony can play in terms of labor markets. So I'm sure I missed some things, but are there other things that my colleagues wanted to add?
There was some discussion about just overall modernizing California's labor laws, and that really no sector should be uncovered at this point in time, and really putting things like enforcement, credentialing, the portability of benefits, all kind of under this new way of how we think about work and protecting workers.
One last thing, a point that I made, which is that as someone who has been a consumer of lots of reports of advisory committees, that I always found it, I was always happier to get a report that had a smaller number of recommendations, but where more thought had gone to how they would be implemented, than a laundry list of recommendations that says things that I already know, like, reducing inequality would be a good thing. Yeah. So, given that a lot of these things are complex issues, and we want to make sure that if we do have a recommendation, we've really thought through how, if you were the labor secretary or the governor, what you would actually do to move that idea forward. That will be time consuming. That will require some work in between meetings. And so at least my vote as a member of the commission would be a smaller number of ideas with more thought given to implementation and really kicking the tires on those ideas, so that we're reasonably confident that if the governor did embrace these, that we're confident that this would be a good thing, because there's no shortage of policies that have been pursued with the best of all intentions that have wound up having perverse unintended consequences.
Yeah. Thank you. Anything more? It sounds like a pretty comprehensive report.
Can I just disrupt
Please.
the process for a second?
Yeah, no,
I'm
please.
curious of the commissioners, just in terms of thumbs up or thumbs sideways. Sideways thumbs up is, I want to talk more about what we just heard, or I really like that idea in terms of the orientation on. I'm just curious.
Oh, sorry. I want to give a little bit of a caveat to what was just said. Can you hear me?
About his
narrowing it down. Is that what your thumbs up?
Yeah,
and
is
thumbs-
Is that how you would characterize? I didn't hear you as narrowing it down as much as
What I was saying is
prioritizing highest
if
impact.
If we have a choice between having a long list of recommendations, but as a result of having a long list, not really having thought about how the governor or the Secretary of Labor or whoever should implement them, that is much less useful to policymakers than having a long list where we say, we would like you to create more high quality jobs and reduce inequality. And I just think given our time constraints, that probably does mean that if we're going to, number one, really think about the implementation and the capacity of the state to move forward on these, and number two, be reasonably confident that we've thought about all of the first and second order consequences of these policies, that will mean by definition that we will probably tend to have a longer list than a shorter list. We could do both by having every idea that we ever thought of in an appendix, but I'm just saying that as a consumer of advisory committees, I always appreciated more thought giving to attention as opposed to a very list of high level goals that didn't tell me what I was supposed to do after I read the report.
So my only fear with that, I hear that, and I like getting very practical, and I like that. My only fear with that is if we narrow it down to things we can all agree on, then we might move away from big ideas towards like more smaller reform type ideas. And so I don't want to lose big ideas, because I've heard so many times from so many people that we have an opportunity to do something really big here, and big picture. And so, maybe it's that we narrow down on a group of a smaller set of things that not everybody agrees on, but some subset of folks really want to work on together, so that we're not having to reach consensus on a smaller set of things. I don't want to lose big ideas.
No. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to disrupt the flow. I was just trying to see if there was a sense of the whole. It's not worth, we have that idea, we're going to hold that idea with other ideas and then keep moving.
Yeah, and I think
I
this
withdraw
is
my thumbs idea.
This is all. It's a part of the process that we're in. Is having this conversation. I would love to hear from the other two groups.
Sure.
Who would like to go next? Okay, great. Thanks.
You said that to me?
Yep.
Okay, cool. My group was Jennifer, Carla, and Lance. And so I'm just going to try to talk quickly and prioritize. So there were several of us that also wanted to talk about incentives for high road businesses. There's some policy already, some draft policy already on the table. Perhaps the governor could say, we want to do this big thing around incentives for all sectors, and we're going to start with sector A and B since it's already baked, and then we can keep going with other sectors. Jennifer said if we're going to do something like that together, then we should think about like an event or some kind of very, very public and personal space where high road employers could be honored and you give a face to the idea. So there was a lot of talk around the incentives piece, tax and other incentives that we've already talked about. Then we talked also about, I brought up the, protection of workers, particularly around gratuities. Gratuities are growing beyond restaurants. They're growing to other sectors because of Apple Pay, Uber, Lyft, Instacart, DoorDash. So some kind of gratuities protection policy. We also talked about the potential to create a worker-owned training company that could be a very large organization of all the food service, 2 million food service workers in California that could simultaneously kind of be a worker organization solution and a training solution and potentially other solutions as well. So we can talk about that in more detail if anybody's interested. We talked about a bill that is already moving that would look at increasing tax rates for companies that have very high CEO to worker pay ratios. And so really getting companies to think about their CEO to worker pay ratios. Jennifer wants us to see us, really massively expand apprenticeships. 500,000 now, 1 million tomorrow, 1 million today. And really providing internet access, high broadband to remote areas of the state, to every resident in the state, really thinking about portable benefits and portable benefits platforms. Um, and Jennifer's big thing was we should have part of this commission. This is what I said about big ideas, is creating moonshots, creating big ideas and challenges that the governor could put out. Which region of the state can have the highest percentage of high road businesses? Which region of the state can come up with the best ideas to solve X problem? So moonshots and challenges. Lance talked about vastly increasing ETP dollars, employment training partnerships dollars. Is that the right spelling of ETP? Yes. Jennifer said, well, maybe you get more ETP as a high road employer, something like that. Carla talked about her local entrepreneurship fund. Did I say that right? Local empowerment fund that she already discussed, as well as thinking about support for remote work. And as we talked about last night, free transit access for workers to get to work. And
was there anything specific about remote work, a suggestion or a solution area, or just
there was an example from Maine,
something
right?
about?
Yeah, I was just using Maine as an example because the state of Maine has tried, because it's a remote state and they have lost a lot of brain power. So what they have done is to say, if you move to Maine and you work in Maine, as long as you're in Maine, we will be paying your student loans. So can you do that in regions of the state that have seen a huge brain drain and encourage economic development in those regions, which is, of course, a lot of that could be remote work as well.
We talked about solutions to something that we've raised multiple times in these meetings, which is really valuing what people call low-wage work as high-skill professional work, so that over time, how those jobs are viewed can change, not based on right now how much they're compensated, but how much they really should be compensated because they're professional skilled work. So I was really riffing, so please bear with me, but things like we were mentioning that in bartending, within food service, bartending alone, they've created a craft cocktail organization and competitions around craft cocktail to really elevate the professional nature of being a bartender. And could you do the same for dishwashers and servers and bussers? Competitions, in the state to be the best busser, the best server, that the governor recognizes those workers in the same way he might recognize high road employers, just to continue to elevate the professional, high skilled nature of these low wage, high skilled jobs. We talked about improving the way WIBs work in the state, workforce investment boards, really modernizing them, forcing them to actually take on new grantees every year because they seem to give grants to the same old folks year after year, forcing them to have real outcomes and metrics. And then I'm going to add one that we didn't talk about, I'm sorry, but I'm going to use the bully pulpit to just add it, which is, can California be the leader in being the first state in the country to ensure that every worker in the state actually receives the minimum wage when they work, including incarcerated and disabled people, so that we are not embarrassed as a state as wildfires continue and we have people fighting those wildfires paid 13 cents an hour.
Thank you. This is an amazing, amazing set of ideas so far. So can we go to the last group?
Yeah, I'm just amazed listening to the other groups. We've all been nodding our heads to each other about how we all really independently of each other were talking about many of the same ideas. So started with our co-chair, Mary Kay Henry, who was talking about extending labor protections and career pathways to workers that are currently carved out of the National Labor Relations Act. And we talked a lot about home care workers, which the other groups did, and how we could create a career path for home care workers into healthcare, and the role of tripartite partnerships between traditional, non-traditional unions, employers, and government to set standards, either through things like wage boards, but it could be minimum compensation standards, training standards, certification standards, and then again partnering with workforce development to move people into career pathways. We, in that context, talked about portable benefits and touched upon the fact that portable benefits, although it's being bandied about like a new idea, has already existed in the building and construction trades for a long time. Or in Hollywood, where Roy and I think, are doing our deep dive with the Hollywood unions, maybe on the 14th of February. It's being scheduled. You will all get invited, but that's also one where
None of you will be invited.
Oh, that's right.
Let's
You can't.
continue our.
Okay,
yeah.
sorry.
It's okay.
Anyway.
We're narrowing
Okay,
in on our time.
So the benefits, the basic idea is the benefits stick with the worker. They follow the worker across employers. We also talked about this model, how it could apply to fast food, 600,000 fast food workers in the state who could also build a powerful organization and bargain around other issues, not necessarily wages, because of the success of the Fight for 15 movement. We then also talked about the need to support small business, particularly in helping people come into compliance with regulations and how we could steer incentives towards small businesses. And then we talked about the need to expand apprenticeship, not just within the building construction trades, but within non-traditional industries, which we're now allowed to do in California due to legislation that passed a few years ago. And then finally, we talked about the carrot and stick approach as well, and the state really putting its money where its mouth is in terms of investing in good jobs and rewarding high road employers. And I want to, is this public yet? These memos? Are these public?
They're drawn, but
Oh, okay. Okay.
Yeah.
Anyway,
You can talk now.
so the controller's office has been doing some work to get a handle on all of the money that comes out the door in the state of California towards employers, whether that be things like workforce investment, tax credits, everything we've talked about. And the idea here is that we should be handing money to employers that create jobs, that provide a living wage and benefits and give workers a voice and are open to workers of all different backgrounds. Along those lines, we also talked about the need to build a bigger stick too, which means adequately funding our labor agencies to enforce the excellent labor laws we have in California, and increasing the penalties that we have, and Cal OSHA comes to mind among many other agencies, so that there's actually some cost to not being a good employer. And then finally, looking at ways that we can incentivize the bad actors to change their behavior, change their ways, and come back over to the good side of the force. So.
And did you have any specific ideas about that?
Well, I gave an example. A few years ago, we passed legislation that for trucking companies at the California ports that are found to be misclassifying workers as independent contractors, they could get amnesty from having to pay the penalties if they voluntarily reclassify their drivers as employees after the ruling came down that they were employees, if that makes sense.
Yep. Okay. Thank you.
Yep.
I am going to turn the remainder of the time back to the co-chairs and would love to hear your kind of reflections on what you've heard.
I'll go first.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. I just want to thank commissioners for I think the rich set of ideas. One of the things that I was doing as people were reporting back, I was looking at the dimensions of our portfolio of recommendations, the kinds of things we want to see in it. And I was just trying to keep track, at least an impressionistic view of where do we seem to have gaps versus what we've heard. So let me just highlight some themes from my tracking. There wasn't a lot that was long-term. So that felt a little light on long term. It also felt light on moonshots. Maybe this is Sarah's point, to really, really bold things that are out there. It also felt a little bit light in terms of things to do with places that are impacted. I think there are a lot of ideas about different demographic groups that are impacted, but not so much on places. So we're a little bit light on ideas for places. It also felt as if we were light on things that involve some of the constituents and actors we've identified. So there was very little around philanthropy, community organizations, academics that those constituencies could be involved in.
Could you bring the mic a little tiny bit closer?
Oh, sorry.
Thank you.
We're a little bit light on some of the actors we've said are important in this. There's a lot on workers, a lot on employers, light on investors, on community organizations and academics and the role that they could play. And on investors, by the way, just as a side note, one of the things that was quite remarkable that happened the last couple of days on a topic like climate, we saw an action where a large investor, this Larry Fink, who's made a big, bold statement, we'll see where it goes, but a big, bold statement about, as investors, how they're going to start to think about issues of climate. You can imagine something similar here that might involve investors. So we're a little bit light on some constituencies. So it is, and then there was nothing about one of the actors here who's a very important one, which is the state as an employer. Because there's some role modeling there that the state itself could do, because it's also an employer in addition to being a legislator. So those are some of the impressionistic gaps, if you like. But hopefully that's just encouragement for us to, as we continue to think, let's just be aware of what may be missing. And as we solicit ideas, as Mary Kay suggested, either from people we know, our communities, our constituents, as we go out into the world and invite people to give us ideas, paying attention to where we seem to have gaps would be wonderful.
Great. Thank you, James, so much for being able to track the grid and highlight the gaps. I think, Lynn, we want to make sure that if anybody used this document and then didn't give it to their recorder, that we want to collect the idea solutions from people. And then I think we want to welcome any idea generation between now and February to go to Julie from any of the commissioners. And then I just wanted to put a plug in for, in addition to thinking of the governor and the legislature and the labor commissioner as sources of, one of the things I was hoping would come out of this is employer, worker, higher ed, kind of tripartite, where we go to the state or the county or wherever and say, hey, we got a really great idea. We want to impact 100,000 people. We want to impact 5 million. Give us a shot, and then let's codify it in law. You know, like I think we want to also make this not just about what government does, but what we're going to all do differently together as civil society to create the social compact. So I just wanted to encourage that spirit as well as we think forward. And then just really appreciate the commissioners that are here and that will recap this, your reactions to the preamble and the problem statement, your thinking about the portfolio that we're going to create. And I believe our intention is to take this set of ideas and then place them in the portfolio that was the last page on the problem statement that thinks about stakeholders, short-term, long-term, midterm, experiment, scalable, moonshot, and then shows you back in a template how we're bunching up around one set of ideas and that we maybe want to spread them out. That's what we want to figure out together. And we'll report that back in February. And then in February and March, we will work the ideas and solutions and try and land by April on a initial draft that makes sense to all of us that we report out in May is kind of the arc of our work going forward. Does that make sense to people? Are there questions? Okay.
Can I add one?
Yes, please.
Thing, Mary Kay, if I may? And I think in addition to the ideas that we as commissioners are going to come with, we are encouraging all of you and indeed the public, if others have ideas, there's going to be mechanisms to contribute those, because I think there may be others who have ideas that we haven't heard and we
That's
don't
right.
have. So in the end, I think it's going to be, we as commissioners will have to, as Mary Kay said, try to consolidate the ideas that we get into a portfolio, but also reach some judgment based on whatever the range of things that we hear as to what are the things that we want to recommend based on all the inputs that have come in to us.
I just want to ask, it's a question about the process in thinking about as we get to April. I don't know if it's more whether I don't remember if we ever talked about what's the decision-making kind of process on like signing off on this sort of final product. Did we ever discuss that, or is that something you're still figuring out?
We talked about it in Convening 2.
Okay,
so
thank you.
it's no wonder you don't remember because it was back in October. And the general theory, Mariana, is that we want a consensus document that we work all the kinks out amongst commissioners for the recommendation to the governor.
Everybody's going to agree on everything?
No,
Everybody's,
there's no consensus, though.
yeah.
Sorry to jump in. Typically, when you work on
Mackenzie.
consensus discussions, it's that we agree with the general direction of the portfolio that we've got. I don't think we'll ever, I'd be surprised if all of us agree on every single recommendation in all its fine detail and wording. But I think we should reach agreement that as a collection, we think these recommendations address the issues that we see. That's at least the sense of a
So here's
consensus
how I
document.
think about it, Saru. If you think about this as civil society trying to reach a social compact, the idea is I'm going to have certain strong opinions about certain things, and then there's going to be things in the document that I don't agree with. But because we are trying to create a new social compact, that's the spirit of the, so we, I think, had this discussion, but we're happy to hear differences. We really don't want minority reports for that reason. Because the whole idea here is what can worker advocacy organizations, employer organizations, higher ed, and the government see as the gathering post for the future social compact is what we hope punches through.
Yeah.
It makes this different than your experience with a long list and no cohesion of, we have to change the direction of growing inequality. And we think it requires a new social compact.
Yeah.
It's kind of the spirit that we're trying to achieve.
I love that. And I also love the notion that you're right was missing, which was it's not just about policy, but about what could a partnership between labor and management and state do?
Sorry, can you get a little closer to the
Sorry.
microphone, folks in the gallery? Thanks.
I do love the partnership idea. The thing, not all of us are in sectors where the industry is willing to work, and instead they go buy a digital ad truck when you propose a solution. And so could there be, just like we've been talking about incentives for high road employers, could there be some kind of incentive coming out of this commission for industries to work with, like to come together and create these partnerships, to come up with joint solutions?
Yeah, so the exclusion isn't perpetuated.
Exactly.
That's the big,
Because
that's your concern.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Like there's
yeah,
some
that
industries
makes
willing to
sense.
work and some others. So
Total
couldn't we
sense.
push some industries that haven't been willing to sit down?
Yeah, I get the concern. So we need to address it collectively.
Yeah.
Great.
And I did have another question about process. So, so what you're talking about will take some time. Are we now going to move away from presentations in the first half of these days so that we can actually work on these things during these meetings? Or are we still going to have presentations at the beginning of the day in the next two meetings?
It looks like Lenny's willing
going
to help
to-
answer that. Because I have to say, James and I, we try and stay on top of these things,
Actually,
but
or
sometimes
Anmol, do you want to take that? It's
Oh.
a question about the design of the convenings going forward and kind of the time of how much time we'll allocate. As we move closer to April, we will have to spend more time in discussion and filtering and judging. But there are still topical areas that will be addressed at each convening, I believe.
The vast bulk of the time is going to be allowing you to do problem solving together. There'll be a little bit of provocation as part of that, with people not to put new problems on the table, but to present ideas or ways to think about solution spaces that just get you in that mindset. No more presentations on facts.
Okay.
Yeah, and at least the way I internalize that, Saru, is that if we've been kind of 80-20 so far, presentations and 20% discussions, we want to flip that a bit.
Yes.
Where it's, us as a commission working through these issues, and yes, some provocation in presentations, but shift should be towards, I think that's a bit of the pivot we talked about today. We need to start to pivot towards what we're going to say.
Had a process request also. As we're moving in this direction, I know everybody's working very, very hard. If it's possible to get materials a little bit before the meeting, just because now we're getting into a level of complexity where some think it would help if we had a little time to think about it in advance of the meetings. That'd be great.
Yeah, and we will also have some kind of online repository that you will be able to consult in between, which will give you visibility into the proposals and the ideas as they're emerging. So I think that also hopefully will help.
Wonderful. So I'm sure the commissioners and James join me in thanking you, Lynn, for designing this section on small groups, and we will continue. And I think we move to Lande.
Yes, we
who's
do.
going to
Thank you.
chair our public comment process. Is that all right? Great, thank you. I wanted to start actually, as we try to do every time, and I think sometimes we are remiss in not spending enough time emphasizing it, but the work of this commission is so generously supported by a number of philanthropic organizations, and in particular, the Irvine Foundation and the Ford Foundation are underwriting much of this work. So I just wanted to start by saying thank you. I think perhaps our colleagues from there have departed, but it's really important that we just show our gratitude to them for supporting our ability to come together once a month for very close to a year. I'm sorry. And the Blue Shield of California and the Lumina Foundation are also supporters. So thank you to them. We have 5 public comment cards. The way in which this section works is that we invite our colleagues in the audience to come and join us for about 2 minutes apiece to speak about any issue that has come up for them during the day or any other issue. The public comment section is not responded to by our commissioners, but in fact, they will be taking notes and kind of incorporating any thoughts and comments you have into their thinking. So we're going to invite you up. I have all the cards here, and we're going to start with Sheni Weber.
Thank you. Good afternoon, commissioners. I've really appreciated the presentations and the discussions here today. I am the Vice Chancellor for Workforce and Economic Development with the California Community College's Chancellor's Office. And I wanted to share with you some work that we're undertaking in the system that I believe are solutions that addresses some of the issues discussed today in workforce diversification, workforce skills development, and rescaling. Regarding the diversification of the technical workforce, the technology workforce that was brought up today, as a system, the California Community Colleges, we have this incredible power of diversity in our students that we really need to figure out how to unleash. Because if you think about how much diversity we can, if we train our students and put them out in the tech workforce who become developers and designers in the ranks in the tech industry that built and designed the algorithms and the data structures and the social applications of AI, not just as consumers, it can go a long way to address some of the bias and discrimination that was talked about today, the inherent issues, right, that either are intentional or unintentional. So we're experimenting with ways to encourage more students to become interested in STEM careers and programs. I'll give you an example of a partnership that we are undertaking. We've been doing that in the past year or so to scale cloud computing program, working with Amazon Web Services. And the students that are participating in the program, we're seeing a lot of gender, age, and ethnic diversity. And the reason why that's really important for us is because cloud computing is a suite of jobs and careers that really touches things like AI, cybersecurity, Internet of Things, and many, many other areas. And another area that we're really working on is the competency-based education model, which is very critical because that's really what I call a semester busting strategy. We just presented to our Board of Governors last week an initial report on the barriers that exist from a financial funding perspective to support competency-based education, because I think that begins to address a lot of things like work-based learning, lifelong learning, and part of the structural and financial issues relate around the time-based credit units that our system is structured on, and that has to be addressed. And then finally, if I can just add one more thing, I would like the Commission to think about integrating ethics of AI and other technology application as part of your discussion, a thread throughout the work that you do, leading the discussion in some guiding principles maybe of some kind that is worker protection, and not just worker protection, but protection for all Californians. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. Thank you. Great, thank you so much. Aaron Ayala with Allies to End Detention. Allies to End Detention.
Hello, my name is Aaron Ayala. I'm here representing Allies to End Detention. We are a relatively young organization. Allies to End Detention is based around the vision that we want to support migrants. We want to support migrants' rights. And as part of that, part of our vision is recognizing migration and settlement in wherever an immigrant would migrate to as a fundamental human right. We are here to support migrant equity and dignity. And as part of that, we believe there is substantial legislative work to be done in dismantling the current system and restructuring it in a way that both broadly represents migrants' rights, but in particular relating it to this event, the way that migrants participate in the workforce and are able to contribute to the economy. The action that we're currently engaged in is we currently have a pen pal system where those who are volunteering for Allies to End Detention are paired up with migrants and receive letters primarily from the Otay Mesa Detention Center, but from other detention centers as well, where they are read and linked in correspondence. Additionally, we are engaged in materials transfer, where we send cash transfers to support migrants through the time that they are detained. And we're currently working on implementing further programs such as a public newsletter that would be available for reading just by the general public, and case management where there would be deeper individual engagement through the organization with people who are currently or have previously been detained. What we would say is that as part of the legislative work that needs to be done, a major consideration is the way that detention affects migrants' abilities to participate in the economy. Particularly, an issue that I had been discussing with my colleague earlier was related to gaps in worker history. A common issue that migrants experience is, as you may be aware, employers don't want a worker that has a gap in their work history because it looks bad, it's questionable, and without an awareness of the particular circumstances, one is likely to just be disqualified from the candidate pool. When a candidate is a migrant who has experienced detainment, their work prospects, because of that gap in labor history, are substantially reduced. Unfortunately, because we're a young organization, we are not at the point of development where we have particular policy solutions to bring to the table, but this is just a small example of the ways in which migrants are alienated from the workforce and alienated from their ability to participate in the economy. And if I have the time, I'd like to read an excerpt from a poem that was sent through correspondence to one of our volunteers. I apologize. I came to the border with the caravan group because I did not know Mexico, and this was my first time in the United States. I left the violence and discrimination in El Salvador that I experienced daily, and for the lack of support for young people, I did not come with family. I want the world to know that the migrants we are, the hope of our families, the hope of our countries, the hope of a better society, the hope of a better world. We are the hope that does not stop shining. We are a light that never ceases to illuminate. Roads, forces, and above all, lives. And we are not what the president believes we are.
Thank you.
Amen. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Next up is John Alquist, who's a professor at UCSD. Is John here? Okay. What about Simone Barron? Simone Barron is a restaurant server at the Full Service Workers.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to you today and to share my experience. My name is Simone Barron, and I'm a tipped restaurant server from Seattle, Washington. And we've heard a lot about Seattle today. I've worked in the industry for 34 years, and I'm here today on behalf of an organization that I co-founded called the Full Service Workers Alliance. I made this trip today because we're talking about the future of work, and for me in Seattle, the future is now. Seattle was the first city in the nation to implement a $15 minimum wage, and it rose to $16.39 on January 1st. But Seattle has a problem. Just like California, we don't count tipped income towards the minimum wage requirement. To be clear, I am progressive in my politics. I was a proud past delegate for Bernie Sanders and for Barack Obama twice. But this progressive policy has left restaurant owners and operators scrambling to reinvent their compensation and business models, which has resulted in a sure loss of income and hours for workers like myself, and restaurant closures for our employers, because it's been impossible to offset the rising rents and wages through menu prices alone. Now, when I've asked my senator, Patty Murray's office, about these issues and other policies, I was told that Seattle is an experiment, which we've heard a lot about that today as well, and that they are watching it closely. And we are already seeing the results of this experiment play out. An article published last Sunday by our food writer at the Seattle Times details 22 restaurant closures that are occurring this year. If we're here today to talk about the future of these wage policies at work, I'm here from Seattle to tell you that the future is now. Because when I go home tomorrow, I'm working my last shift because my job, my restaurant, is closing. And this was a gradual progression. First, I had a loss of income because they restructured the model. Then we lost hours and support staff jobs. And tomorrow, my restaurant closes. And now we're worried about where our next paycheck is going to come from. And we're hearing stories like this coming from San Francisco too, with restaurant closures and jobs lost. And it's the same 1-2 punch that we keep hearing, the rising rents and unsustainable labor costs surrounding tipped workers. So something is not right. Now, I worry about the future of the industry I work in that's allowed for me to provide for myself, to go to school and raise a child as a single mom. And I worry about my coworkers' futures who are suffering the same fate. But I know I'm not alone because there are thousands of tipped workers across the country, and we've organized to oppose the efforts that would eliminate tipped wage system that has done so much good for so many. It's my hope that we take advantage of the opportunity that we have in this future of work conversation to discuss a restaurant industry with fiscally healthy establishments employing workers that have job security, flexible schedules, and the ability to maximize their incomes. Now, I encourage you, all of you, to take a hard look at the ramifications of the policies that you're proposing and how they pertain to the full-service restaurant industry, and how the effects of these policies ultimately land on workers like myself as I go home tomorrow and work my last shift. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Our last commenter is Nick Gaines, a community engineer with Henry Stern's office.
Thank you. Hey, everybody. My name is Nick Gaines. I'm with Senator Stern's office. I just wanted to speak to you all very briefly about a piece of legislation we're working on where the senator is trying to create a climate workforce for the state of California. This directly, I think, addresses James's point about how we need to think more about the state as an employer. The draft language is not currently in print, but we'll be submitting it to the Legislative Counsel's office in the coming weeks. So by the next convening, I hope to have the language before the Secretary of Labor's office and the Institute for the Future team so that we can circulate it to all of you. The senator really wants to work with this commission to flesh out the mechanics of how that legislation would work, because we know that properly designed and implemented legislation the first time is what it takes to have the highest impact and to benefit the thousands of families and dozens of communities across California that we are designing this legislation to benefit. So thank you all so much for your time, and looking forward to working with you on all this.
Thank you. Great, thank you.
Henry, we missed him. Henry, we missed him.
Please tell Henry we miss him. That was the comment. Okay, I think that is the end of our public comment. James and Mary Kay, did you have any final closing thoughts?
No, other than to thank the commissioners for sticking with this and for the time and effort you put into this. We know we ask a lot of each other in terms of materials to read and prepare and so forth. So we thank you for your continued engagement. I think hopefully we're now in the more important part of our efforts. So thank you.
And I want to thank the governor's team for encouraging our Secretary of Labor, Julie Su, to get to her daughter's basketball game on time in Anaheim. We believe in work-family balance. So thank you, Londe, for holding down the fort and for the entire
The governor's team agreed to pay her speeding ticket in case
Oh,
got pulled
that's
over.
good. And thanks to all the members of the public that joined us today. Thank you. Thank you, Tom. Isn't that great? I was wondering where. Yeah, I wanted people to.